December cold. When Elizabeth Taylor, one of the world's most famous women, walked through the doors of the Betty Ford Center, Hollywood history changed forever. But this story didn't begin with the 7-week treatment sentence that hit the press. The real beginning was the night before. In her Beverly Hills mansion, her son and family stood in a circle. Fear was in their eyes. The words they were about to say would save Elizabeth's life, but first they had to break her. After that night, Hollywood's most powerful taboo shattered. Because what Elizabeth Taylor was about to do could have ended a career in those days, but instead it saved millions. This is not a story of collapse, but of revolution. And it all began with 2 words no one could say out loud: Rehab confession. Before you continue watching this video, don't forget to hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications. Because untold stories from Hollywood's golden age to today are waiting for you. In the late 1950s, Elizabeth Taylor was the world's brightest star. Violet eyes, porcelain skin, flawless performance in every role. MGM Studios had raised her like a princess. At 18, millions knew her name. But behind this brilliance there was a truth no one saw. Because Elizabeth Taylor wasn't just an actress, she was a symbol. A perfect example of the role Hollywood assigned to women. Be beautiful, be silent, do what the studio wants. And Elizabeth conformed to this role at first. Her first marriage was at 18 to Nicky Hilton. It started like a fairy tale. But when the curtain closed, reality began. Hilton's violence, alcohol problems, and Elizabeth's pain. This marriage lasted 8 months. The star was broken, but she kept smiling in front of the cameras. The following years were like a revolving door. One marriage, one divorce, another marriage. 2 children with Michael Wilding. Then Mike Todd. Todd was different. Elizabeth truly loved him. But in 1958, Todd's private plane crashed and Elizabeth was alone again. This time the pain was different. Because now the world was watching her. Magazines tracked her every move. Paparazzi waited at every corner. And Elizabeth was being crushed under this attention. The first pills given after Todd's death were for sleep. Doctors said just temporary. But temporary things sometimes become permanent. And for Elizabeth, this was the beginning of a journey that would last 30 years. In 1959, Eddie Fisher came along, Todd's closest friend, Debbie Reynolds' husband, the husband of Elizabeth's best friend. But loneliness and pain silence logic. Eddie and Elizabeth came together. The world went crazy. Homewrecker, they said. Woman who betrayed her friend, they said. Even the Vatican condemned Elizabeth. But no one asked, what was this woman going through? No one saw. The pills she took to sleep at night. The coffee she drank to stay awake during the day. The role she played in front of cameras. Elizabeth married Fisher but couldn't marry away her pain. The pills continued. She had chronic back pain. Injuries from horse accidents in the past. Doctors wrote prescriptions. Percocet, Demerol, Valium. All legal. All necessary. But all a trap. No one in Hollywood was talking. But everyone knew. Studio heads whispered in meetings. Directors looked at each other anxiously on sets. Elizabeth's drug use was no longer secret. Sometimes shoots were postponed. Sometimes they waited for hours. Sometimes even when she showed up on set, her mind was foggy. But no one said anything. Because she was Elizabeth Taylor. She was breaking box office records. Every film made millions. And in Hollywood, when money talked, problems were quietly buried. Studios issued health problems statements to the press. Producers would pay off doctors with money, ignore the increase in Elizabeth's prescriptions. This silence wasn't protection. It was conspiracy. And Elizabeth was getting lost in the middle of this conspiracy. In 1961, the Cleopatra set brought Elizabeth to the breaking point. When filming started in Rome, she was already fragile. Chronic pain had intensified. Drug doses had increased. And then pneumonia came. Elizabeth nearly died. She had a tracheotomy. A tube was inserted into her throat. The world watched as they almost lost her. But Elizabeth survived. And when she returned to set, Richard Burton was there. Cleopatra's Marcus Antonius. A married man. But for Elizabeth, this was a detail. Because in Richard, she saw herself. Alcohol. Cigarettes. Addiction. Together they set the world on fire. Their relationship was a scandal. Their marriage was a drama. But for Elizabeth, Richard was someone she could share her loneliness with. Two broken people, holding on to each other as they sank. Richard and Elizabeth's marriage was Hollywood's most talked-about relationship. Liz and Dick, the press called them. Drinking champagne on a yacht in Porto Ercole, fighting in Paris, making up in Gstaad. But behind the luxury was decay. Richard started mornings with whiskey. Elizabeth took her pills 5 or 6 times a day. Neither could help the other because both were drowning. One night, drunk, Richard yelled at Elizabeth, "We're both dying and you know it." Elizabeth answered through tears, "But at least we're dying together." This tragic romance was a movie, but unsustainable in real life. They divorced in 1974. The world was shocked, but actually it wasn't surprising. Everyone knew this relationship only stood on passion. When passion ended, only addiction remained. In 1964, Elizabeth and Richard got married. The next 10 years were like a speeding train. Diamonds, yachts, films, alcohol, fights, reconciliations, and pills. Elizabeth's back pain never went away. Surgeries followed one another. After each surgery came new prescriptions. Doctors said just for pain. But the pain wasn't just physical. The emotional void hurt too. Her relationship with Richard was passionate but destructive. Alcohol had taken over both of them. They divorced remarried in 1975, divorced again in 1976. Elizabeth was lost now. She had a star identity but no identity of her own. Cameras still watched her, but what she saw in the mirror was a stranger. The years from 1976 to 1983 were covered in fog. Elizabeth married Senator John Warner, moved to Washington, played the First Lady role, cocktails, politics, etiquette. But Elizabeth Taylor was not a politician's wife. She was a star, and stars fade in Washington salons. In a 1987 Vogue interview, she said, "I lost my identity. I became John's wife but stopped being Elizabeth." These were the darkest years, because now there was no set, no camera, no role, just emptiness, and there were pills to fill that emptiness. Chronic pain continued. Doctors kept writing prescriptions, and Elizabeth had stopped controlling it. A pill in the morning to sleep, a pill in the afternoon to stay awake, a drink in the evening to numb out, another pill at night to sleep again. During the Warner marriage, Elizabeth gained weight. The press was merciless. Fat Liz headlines ran. Photos were published. Comparisons were made. Young, thin, beautiful Elizabeth versus the tired, overweight Elizabeth now. But no one asked. Why? No one saw. The side effects of prescription drugs, the painkillers slowing metabolism, emotional eating. With each attack, Elizabeth retreated deeper. And the deeper she retreated, the more drugs she needed. This was a vicious cycle. The drugs made her sick. When she got sick, she took more drugs, and the press judged her at every step. In 1982, she divorced Warner. She was 50 years old. She had been married 7 times. For years, she had been known as the world's most beautiful woman. But when she looked in the mirror, who did she see? Elizabeth didn't know, and this not knowing pulled her deeper. The pills were no longer for pain. Now they were taken just to exist. But family saw. Her sons saw. Those close to her saw. And they were terrified. Because Elizabeth Taylor was dying. Slowly, in a way no one could stop. But there was only one way to stop it. Intervention. The intervention plan was prepared for weeks. Her sons met with therapists. A professional intervention specialist was hired. Everyone learned their role. Because convincing Elizabeth wouldn't be easy. She had been used to being in control all her life. She had controlled Hollywood, controlled her marriages, controlled her image, but she couldn't control her addiction. And getting her to admit that was the hardest part. The intervention specialist told her family, "She'll get angry, she'll deny, she'll attack you, but if you truly love her, you'll keep going." At the beginning of December 1983, a meeting was held at her Beverly Hills mansion. Her sons were there. Close friends were there. When Elizabeth entered the living room, she didn't understand what was happening. But then she saw. They were all looking at her. Love was in their eyes, but also fear. And then they started talking. "Mom, we're losing you. Elizabeth, you can't go on like this. You won't survive." The words were like sharp knives. Elizabeth got angry at first, then went on the defensive. "I'm fine," she said. "I'm just tired," she said. But everyone knew this was a lie, and Elizabeth knew too, because when she looked in the mirror in the mornings, she didn't remember who she saw. When she slept at night, she forgot who she was married to. Her life had become a blur, and that night, sitting across from her family hearing the truth, was perhaps the first time she truly saw the mirror. The intervention lasted hours. Everyone spoke. Everyone voiced their concerns. Elizabeth listened. She resisted at first, but then something broke. Maybe it was the last defensive wall inside her. Because that night, for the first time in her 51 years, she admitted, "I need help." Those 3 words would change the world. But first they would change Elizabeth. The next morning, December 5, 1983, Elizabeth Taylor got in a car. The place she was about to go was far from Beverly Hills, Rancho Mirage, in the California desert, away from luxury villas where spotlights couldn't reach, Betty Ford Center. In those days, the word rehab was like a curse in Hollywood. Addiction wasn't talked about. Studios would suppress this kind of news. Managers would issue fatigue or flu statements to the press. Celebrities would quietly go to private clinics and return without telling anyone. But Elizabeth Taylor didn't play this game. When she entered Betty Ford, a statement was made to the press: treatment for alcohol and prescription drug addiction. Hollywood was shocked. Because this was more than a confession. This was breaking a taboo. This was the world's most famous woman showing her vulnerability in front of cameras. And this courage would change history. But first, a 7-week journey would begin for Elizabeth. And this journey would be the hardest 7 weeks of her life. Betty Ford Center was not a luxury hotel. This was a hospital. Serious, harsh, a real treatment center. Elizabeth was shocked when she first arrived. Because here no one addressed her as Miss Taylor. She was just Elizabeth. She shared the same room with other patients, ate the same meals, followed the same routines, wake up at 6 in the morning, group therapies, individual sessions, mandatory exercises, and there was no escape. The first days were like hell. Elizabeth cried, got angry. "I don't belong here," she said. But the therapist told her the truth. "Elizabeth, this is exactly where you belong, because here we're all the same. We're all trying to survive." The first week was the detox process. Her body was cleansing itself of drugs accumulated over years. Tremors, sweating, nausea, headaches. Elizabeth was suffering physically. But everyday therapist reminded her, "This is temporary, but if you go back, you might not make it next time." That sentence kept Elizabeth going, because she knew this was her last chance. She was 51. Her body was tired. She had been through 30 surgeries. She might not be this lucky again. This time she would either heal or never heal. In group therapy, Elizabeth listened. Different people, different stories, but the same pain. A mother, with the fear of losing her children. A businessman who had nearly destroyed his career. A teacher who had secretly been drinking through her days. And Elizabeth understood. Addiction didn't discriminate. Rich, poor, famous, ordinary. It could catch anyone. And it destroyed everyone the same way. When Elizabeth spoke for the first time, her voice started with a tremor. "I'm Elizabeth Taylor, and I'm an addict." This sentence freed her. Because for the first time she had shed her role. For the first time she was truly herself. Treatment days were heavy. Because addiction wasn't just about quitting the drugs. The real issue was understanding why she needed those drugs. Therapist dug. They went to her childhood. The pressures that began when she signed with MGM at 11. Hilton, who she was forced to marry at 18. The pain she retreated into when she lost Mike Todd. The crazy love with Richard. Every marriage, every divorce, every loss. All layers. And under every layer was the same question. Who am I? Elizabeth had avoided this question for years. But at Betty Ford there was nowhere to run. She had to look in the mirror. And what she saw was a woman she hadn't known for 51 years. Broken, tired, but still alive. In the 3rd week, Elizabeth received a letter from Richard Burton. The letter was short but emotional. "Liz, I heard. I'm proud. You were always the bravest woman. I hope you find peace." Elizabeth cried as she read the letter. Because Richard was the only person who understood her. They had both lived through the same hell. But now Elizabeth was searching for a way out. Richard was still in it. A year later, Richard Burton died of cirrhosis. Elizabeth attended his funeral and thought, if her family hadn't intervened that night, maybe she'd be with Richard, among the dead. In the 4th week, a turning point came. Elizabeth cried as she spoke in group therapy. I always thought that if I was beautiful enough, if I was famous enough, if I was loved enough, that emptiness would fill. But it didn't. It never did. This confession silenced the room, because everyone knew that emptiness. Everyone had tried to fill that emptiness. Alcohol, drugs, food, sex, whatever. But nothing could fill it. Elizabeth continued. Maybe the problem wasn't when I was myself, but when I was trying to be someone. Maybe I always looked in the wrong places. Maybe the answer was inside me, and I never looked. The therapist looked at her and smiled. Elizabeth, that's the most important lesson you can learn in these 7 weeks. In the 5th week, Elizabeth created a new routine. Meditation in the mornings, walks in the afternoon, journal writing in the evenings. These ordinary activities were revolutionary for Elizabeth, because all her life she had lived with chaos. Now she was learning order and peace. Therapists taught her, addiction feeds on feeling out of control. If you create control, addiction weakens. Elizabeth tested this. She woke up at the same time every morning, ate meals at the same time every day, went to bed at the same time every night, and over time her body responded. Pain decreased, sleep patterns normalized, mind cleared. In the 6th week, Elizabeth began rebuilding her identity. But this time, not the Elizabeth that Hollywood created. The real Elizabeth. Not the violet-eyed goddess. Just a woman with mistakes, with fears, with pain. But also a strong, resilient, surviving woman. Therapists taught her. Addiction was a disease, not moral weakness, not character flaw. A medical condition that needed treatment. And this understanding was revolutionary for Elizabeth. Because for years she had blamed herself. Why can't I stop? Why am I not stronger? But now she understood. Strength was asking for help. Strength was accepting vulnerability. When the 7th week ended, Elizabeth was ready. When she left Betty Ford in late January 1984, the world was waiting for her. Cameras, questions, curiosity. But Elizabeth was different now. On her way out, she made a brief statement to the press. These 7 weeks saved my life, and if there's anyone struggling like I was, know that asking for help is not weakness. These sentences changed history. Because for the first time, a Hollywood star was openly talking about addiction. For the first time, defining this issue not as a scandal but as a disease. And the world listened. But Elizabeth's struggle didn't end. In the years after Betty Ford, she returned to treatment several more times. Because addiction was a chronic disease. It didn't just go away once. It required constant vigilance, constant care. Elizabeth accepted this, and with each fall, she got back up. In a 1987 Vogue interview, "Without Betty Ford, I wouldn't be here today. That place gave me my life back. But more importantly, it gave me myself back." In 1985, a phone call reshaped Elizabeth's life again. Her close friend Rock Hudson was dying. AIDS in those days, this word was a death sentence, and no one was talking. Hollywood was silent. The government was silent. Society was silent. But Elizabeth couldn't stay silent. When Rock died, Elizabeth didn't mourn. She went to war. She founded AMFAR, the American Foundation for AIDS Research. She organized galas, raised millions, created awareness, and broke another taboo. In those days, talking about AIDS could end careers, but Elizabeth didn't care, because now she knew staying silent was deadly. Speaking saved lives. This was the lesson she learned at Betty Ford. When you defeat your shame, you give hope to others. In the 1990s, Elizabeth was now an activist. She wasn't making films, but she was making a difference. She spoke at AIDS galas every year, spoke about addiction on every platform. And in every speech she gave the same message. There's nothing to be ashamed of. Once a journalist asked, "Doesn't it bother you to talk so openly about your addiction?" Elizabeth laughed. "Bother me? No, because when I stopped being ashamed, I became free. This freedom was contagious. Other celebrities started talking. Other patients started asking for help. Elizabeth's courage had created a domino effect. By the 2000s, Elizabeth Taylor was a legend. But now she was known not just for her beauty, but for her courage and struggle. She had been married 8 times, but her real achievement was getting up after every fall. She had gone through hundreds of surgeries but was still standing. She had battled addiction, but now the control was hers. And most importantly, she had refused to stay silent. When Elizabeth Taylor died in 2011, the world lost a star. But her legacy was much bigger, because she had opened the door for mental health and addiction issues to be discussed in Hollywood. Today, when a celebrity enters rehab, no one is surprised. In fact, they get support. Statements are made on social media. Fans say thank you for being strong. But in 1983, it wasn't like that. Back then, it was a scandal, a career ender. Elizabeth Taylor changed this perception single-handedly. When she entered Betty Ford on December 5, 1983, a star walked through the door, but a pioneer walked out. In 7 weeks, Hollywood's biggest taboo shattered, and millions could walk through that door after her. Because Elizabeth had shown them the way. This story is not a gossip story. This is a survival story. This is a woman who lost her identity finding herself. This is the world's most famous star asking for help in her darkest night. And perhaps most importantly, this is proof that defeating shame and speaking up is more powerful than staying silent. Elizabeth Taylor had 7 marriages, made hundreds of films, touched millions of hearts. But her greatest performance started when she left Betty Ford. Because from that moment on, she proved something not just to herself, but to the whole world. Recovery is possible. If this video made you feel something, please don't forget to like it. Share your thoughts in the comments. Because while Elizabeth's story may be over, the path she opened is still going. And maybe on that path, there's your story too.